Rude customer mocks a boy with Down syndrome at a toy store. Then Morgan Freeman steps in and shocks everyone. Can you hurry up? I don't have all day for this. The voice was sharp, impatient, cutting through the warm, cheerful atmosphere of Toy Kingdom like a blade. Standing at the checkout counter, 10-year-old Tommy clutched a shiny red toy car in his hands, his small fingers tracing the smooth curves of the model. His eyes sparkled with excitement. He had been saving up for this moment for weeks. Is respect worth more than money? Comment 1. Or does wealth define worth? Comment 0. But the man behind him in line, Greg, had no patience for joy, no space for kindness. He rolled his eyes, scoffing audibly, then muttered just loud enough for the nearby customers to hear, "Kids like him shouldn't even be out in public." The words hung in the air, heavy and cruel. Tommy's mother, Sarah, stiffened beside him, her breath catching in her throat. She had heard comments like this before, too many times. But no matter how much she tried to prepare, it always felt like a slap. People in the store froze, exchanging awkward glances. Some shifted uncomfortably, looking away. No one said anything. No one, except for one man. Sitting quietly in a reading nook near the store's cafe, Morgan Freeman slowly set down the book he had been flipping through. He had been observing the scene from a distance, but now it was time to speak. What would you do in this situation? Would you stay silent or would you stand up for what's right? Keep listening to find out what happens next. It had started as a simple, happy afternoon. Tommy and his mother had come to Toy Kingdom just like any other family, walking through the aisles, laughing, pointing at toys, enjoying the magic of childhood. For Tommy, a boy who saw the world with pure excitement and wonder, every shelf was a treasure chest. But there was only one thing he truly wanted, a red die-cast model car, identical to the ones his late father used to collect. And today was the day he finally had enough money to buy it. Sarah had smiled as she watched her son carefully count out his crumpled bills and loose change, placing them on the counter with a sense of pride and accomplishment. But then, just as the cashier reached for the money, Greg had ruined everything. "Seriously?" Greg had scoffed, throwing up his hands. "You're going to make us all wait for this?" Tommy flinched at the harsh tone, his small hands gripping the toy car tighter. Sarah's stomach dropped. She knew where this was going. She had seen it before. And when Greg leaned in slightly, lowering his voice but making sure it was still loud enough to be heard, her worst fears were confirmed. I mean, does he even understand what he's doing? It was an insult wrapped in mocking curiosity, the kind of statement meant to degrade rather than question. Sarah's breath shuddered, her fingers twitching with the urge to protect her son, to shield him from the cruelty of the world. But before she could open her mouth, a slow, deliberate voice filled the air, silencing the entire store. "Now, that's an interesting thing to say." Sarah turned sharply, as did everyone else. And there, walking toward the counter with the steady grace of a man who had seen far too much injustice in his lifetime, was Morgan Freeman. His gaze locked onto Greg, and in that moment, the entire room held its breath. The air inside Toy Kingdom was filled with the excited chatter of children and the soft melody of holiday music playing through the speakers. Brightly colored shelves lined with action. Figures, dolls, and remote-controlled cars made the store feel like a wonderland for any child lucky enough to visit. For 10-year-old Tommy, this was the best day ever. He carefully ran his fingers over the glossy packaging of a red die-cast model car, his eyes gleaming with excitement. He had saved up for weeks, picking up coins from under the couch, helping his mom fold laundry, even skipping his favorite candy at the grocery store, just so he could buy this car. This wasn't just any toy, it was exactly like the ones his late father used to collect, and to Tommy it felt like owning a little piece of him again. His mother, Sarah, stood beside him, watching with a tender smile as he admired the toy. "Are you sure about this one, buddy?" she asked. Tommy nodded eagerly. "Yes, Mom. It's perfect." With great care, he lifted the toy and walked toward the register, holding it as if it were made of gold. But just as he placed the car on the counter and began counting his crumpled bills and loose change, a deep, impatient sigh cut through the cheerful atmosphere. Behind them in line stood Greg, a middle-aged man with an expensive watch and a face twisted in irritation. He shifted his weight, crossing his arms as if simply standing there was an unbearable inconvenience. His son, a boy about Tommy's age, stood beside him, scrolling through a phone, barely paying attention. Greg exhaled sharply, glancing at his own watch, then let out another dramatic sigh. "Seriously?" he muttered under his breath. Sarah stiffened, recognizing the tone before even turning to see the man behind them. Tommy, oblivious to the growing tension, continued counting his money carefully, making sure he had just enough. The cashier, Emma, a young woman in her 20s, smiled patiently. "Almost there, buddy," she said kindly. But Greg, he had no patience for kindness. "Oh, come on," he suddenly snapped, throwing up his hands. "You're going to make us all wait for this?" The words hit Sarah like a slap. She turned sharply, her protective instincts immediately kicking in, but before she could speak, Tommy's smile had already faded. His hands, once steady, began to fumble with the coins, his movements slower now, less confident. He could feel the eyes on him, feel the weight of Greg's frustration pressing down. "I'm almost done," Tommy mumbled, his voice softer now. Greg scoffed, shaking his head. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "You'd think the store would have a separate line for situations like this." Sarah's jaw clenched. "Situations like what?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. Greg shrugged, gesturing lazily toward Tommy. "You know," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "kids like him. It's just, I don't know, distracting. Slows everything down." The words felt like a knife twisting in Sarah's chest. She had heard it before. Too many times, the quiet whispers, the looks of pity, the impatient stares from strangers who acted like her son's existence was an inconvenience to them. She had fought battles like this all her life, but no matter how many times it happened, it never hurt any less. A hush fell over the store. Nearby customers who had previously been engaged in their own shopping now turned their heads, drawn in by the tension. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others stared at the scene unfolding, too unsure to intervene. Emma, the cashier, shifted awkwardly, looking between Sarah and Greg, her hands frozen over the register. And Tommy. Tommy stood there, his once bright eyes now cast downward, his fingers still holding onto his toy car. He didn't fully understand why the man was angry, but he understood one thing very clearly. He had done something wrong. Sarah felt her hands tremble. She wanted to scream, to tell this man exactly how cruel and ignorant he was, to demand that he look at her son and see the incredible boy she saw every single day. But she knew this fight wasn't just about her emotions. It was about Tommy. She crouched down, cupping his cheek gently. "You're doing great, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Tommy nodded hesitantly, but the light in his eyes was dimmer now. Sarah swallowed hard before standing, turning to Greg with fierce determination. "My son has every right to be here," she said, her voice steady but ice cold. Greg smirked, completely unfazed. "Sure," he said, shrugging, "but that doesn't mean the rest of us have to wait while he figures out how to count to 10. A few gasps whispered through the crowd. The insult landed like a punch, its cruelty undeniable. Tommy flinched, his fingers gripping his car tighter than ever. Sarah's breath shook, her nails digging into her palms. How dare he? How could someone be so openly heartless? The words burned in her throat, ready to spill out in a fury she knew she wouldn't be able to contain. But she didn't have to, because at that exact moment a slow, deliberate voice cut through the tension like a blade. Now, that's an interesting thing to say. Greg's smirk froze. Sarah's breath hitched. Tommy's eyes lifted, curious. And as the crowd turned toward the speaker, their faces reflected a single emotion: shock. They are walking toward the checkout line with the grace of a man who had seen the world's cruelty too many times and refused to accept it. Was Morgan Freeman. His gaze locked onto Greg, his expression unreadable. But the message was clear. This wasn't over. Greg thought he was in control. He thought no one would challenge him. But what he didn't know, what no one in that store could have predicted, was that the man about to teach him a lesson was Morgan Freeman. The entire store had fallen into an eerie silence. Morgan Freeman stood there, his deep, steady voice still lingering in the air, challenging the cruel words Greg had just spat out. Greg blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He hadn't expected to be confronted, especially not by Morgan Freeman. The once lively toy store now felt like a courtroom where everyone in attendance awaited the final verdict. And the man standing before them? He was the judge. Greg let out an awkward chuckle, shifting uncomfortably. I didn't mean anything by it, he muttered, glancing around the store, searching for validation, but no one came to his defense. Instead, the once passive customers, the same people who had initially turned away in discomfort, now stood taller, bolder, watching with sharpened eyes. Morgan Freeman tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "You didn't mean anything by it," he repeated, his tone calm but piercing. "Then why did you say it?" Greg's face reddened slightly. He stammered, but for the first time that evening, he had no clever response. Tommy, still clutching his red toy car, looked up at Morgan with wide, trusting eyes. He didn't fully understand why this man was standing up for him, but he felt safe in his presence. Sarah, standing protectively beside her son, finally found her voice. "You don't get to humiliate my child and then pretend it's no big deal," she said, her voice steady despite the anger burning beneath it. Greg exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Oh, come on," he scoffed. "You're making this a bigger deal than it is. I just don't understand why kids like him are—" Morgan lifted a single finger, stopping Greg in his tracks. "Careful," he said, his voice lowering just enough to make every syllable land like a hammer. "Think very carefully about what you're about to say next." Greg clamped his mouth shut, swallowing hard. The energy in the room had shifted completely. Morgan turned to Tommy, his demeanor instantly softening. "What's your name, young man?" he asked, crouching slightly to meet Tommy's gaze. Tommy smiled shyly, his grip tightening around his toy car. "Tommy," he answered. Morgan smiled back. "That's a strong name," he said. "And what do you have there?" Tommy's face lit up. "It's a race car, just like the ones my dad used to have." Morgan nodded thoughtfully. "And you picked it out yourself?" Tommy nodded enthusiastically. "I saved my money for it." Morgan chuckled. "That's impressive," he said. "Not everyone has the patience and dedication to save for something they really want. That makes you pretty special, don't you think?" Tommy beamed with pride, nodding. Morgan then straightened, turning back toward Greg, his expression shifting once again, calm but unwavering. "And yet," he continued, "you thought he was less deserving of being here than you were." Greg said nothing. Morgan sighed, shaking his head. "Let me tell you something, Greg," he said, his voice filled with quiet authority. "The strongest people I've ever met weren't the ones who had the most money. They weren't the loudest in the room. They weren't the ones who thought they were better than everyone else." Morgan placed a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder. "The strongest people," he said, "are the ones who keep moving forward, no matter how many obstacles are put in front of them. The ones who refuse to let the world tell them they don't belong." He turned back to Greg. "Tell me, Greg," he asked, "do you think you could walk a mile in this boy's shoes?" Greg shifted uncomfortably, looking away. Morgan didn't wait for an answer. "Because I'll tell you this," he continued, "I'd bet my last dollar that he could walk a mile in yours. And he'd do it with more grace than you've shown today." A murmur rippled through the store. A few customers nodded in agreement. Some even clapped softly. Greg, feeling the weight of 100 eyes on him, took a slow, unsteady step backward. The store remained silent as Morgan turned to the cashier, Emma, who had been watching with wide eyes. "Ring up Tommy's car, please," he said, placing a crisp bill on the counter. Emma immediately obeyed, her hands moving quickly. "It's on me," Morgan added before Sarah could protest. Sarah's eyes welled with tears, her lips parting as if to argue. But Morgan shook his head gently. "Consider it a thank you," he said, "for raising such a fine young man." Sarah blinked rapidly, nodding. "Thank you," she whispered. Morgan turned back to Tommy, who was holding his new toy with pure joy. "You take care of that car, all right," he said. "And remember, just because someone tries to make you feel small doesn't mean you are." Tommy nodded enthusiastically, clutching the toy close to his chest. Greg, still standing awkwardly near the counter, exhaled sharply. He glanced around, noticing the disapproving stares from nearly every customer in the store. His ego had been bruised in a way that wouldn't heal overnight. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed toward the exit, the bell above the door jingling loudly as he shoved it open. Morgan watched him go, then turned back to Tommy and Sarah. "You see, kindness isn't about grand gestures," he said, his voice now warm again. "It's about making sure the people around you know they matter." Sarah nodded, smiling through her tears. Tommy grinned. "Like when I share my toys?" he asked innocently. Morgan chuckled, ruffling his hair. "Exactly like that, kiddo." As Morgan Freeman turned to leave, the store broke into quiet applause. The moment had started with cruelty, but it had ended with a lesson in respect, dignity, and the power of standing up for others. As Sarah and Tommy stepped out into the crisp evening air, Tommy looked up at his mother, his heart light and full. "Mom, do you think Mr. Freeman is a superhero?" he asked, his small fingers still gripping the red race car. Sarah laughed softly, shaking her head. "No, sweetheart," she said. "He's just a good man who knows when to speak up. And sometimes that was all it took to change the world for someone else." A thick silence hung in the air, heavier than the brightly colored shelves filled with toys. All eyes were now on Morgan Freeman, whose steady presence seemed to shift the very energy of the store. Greg, who had spent the past few minutes belittling a child without a second thought, suddenly found himself on the receiving end of the kind of attention he never wanted. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Listen, I don't see why this is turning into a whole thing," he said, forcing a chuckle. "I wasn't trying to be mean, just stating the obvious. We've all got places to be, and some of us don't have all day to wait around." Morgan tilted his head slightly, studying Greg the way a professor might study a student who had just given the wrong answer in class. "The obvious," Morgan repeated, his voice smooth as silk but carrying the weight of unshakable wisdom. "That's an interesting way to describe rudeness." Greg shifted uncomfortably. "Come on, man," he scoffed, crossing his arms. "You're telling me you don't get even a little annoyed when someone slows up the line?" Morgan's brows lifted ever so slightly, as if the very notion of what Greg had just said was almost amusing to him. "No," he said simply. Greg opened his mouth, then closed it. He hadn't expected that. "You see," Morgan continued, his gaze never leaving Greg's, "I've met a lot of people in my lifetime, and I've learned something about true character." He gestured toward Tommy, who still clutched his toy car, his innocent eyes darting between the adults, unsure of what would happen next. "Character," Morgan said, "isn't measured by how fast you move. It isn't defined by how much money you have. It isn't even about how successful you are." His eyes darkened slightly, the depth of his words reaching beyond the moment, beyond the store. "Character is about how you treat people when you think no one is watching." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some customers who had previously stayed silent now nodded in quiet agreement. A woman near the plush toy section folded her arms, frowning at Greg. A father holding his daughter's hand tightened his grip, as if suddenly realizing how much this moment mattered. Greg let out a forced chuckle, trying to shake off the intensity of Morgan's presence. "Look, I don't need a lecture," he muttered, his bravado slipping. Morgan took a slow step forward, his presence filling the space between them. "Oh, but you do," he said, his voice lowering slightly, making each word feel heavier. "Because right now you have a choice. You can walk away, pretend this never happened, and continue believing that making someone feel small makes you bigger." Morgan paused, letting the words settle into Greg's chest like a weight he couldn't shake off. "Or," he continued, "you can realize that real strength, real power, it comes from lifting others up, not pushing them down." Greg's jaw tightened, but for the first time he didn't argue. For the first time that evening, he had nothing to say. Morgan turned back to Tommy, his expression instantly softening. "Young man," he said, crouching slightly to meet Tommy's gaze, "what's your favorite thing about that car?" Tommy, who had been holding his breath throughout the exchange, lit up at the question. "It's red," he exclaimed, "and it's super fast." Morgan chuckled, nodding. "Fast cars are pretty cool, huh?" he said. Tommy nodded enthusiastically, the excitement returning to his face. Morgan then glanced at Sarah, who was still processing everything, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "Ma'am," he said gently, "you have a fine young man here." Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat, nodding. "I know," she whispered. Morgan turned back to Emma, the cashier, who had been watching with wide eyes, frozen in the moment. "Ring him up," Morgan said, "and put it on me." Emma blinked, stunned. "Mr. Freeman, you don't have to—" "I want to," Morgan interrupted, his smile never faltering. Sarah started to protest, but Morgan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Consider it my way of making sure Tommy remembers that today wasn't about the bad, it was about the people who stood up for what was right." Sarah let out a shaky breath, then nodded. "Thank you," she said softly. Tommy, unaware of the gravity of the situation but thrilled nonetheless, grinned from ear to ear. "Thank you, Mr. Freeman," Morgan winked. "You just make sure to race that car as fast as you can, all right?" Tommy giggled. "I will." Greg stood awkwardly, watching the exchange unfold, the weight of what had just happened settling into his chest like a stone. The judgmental glances from other customers, the fact that his behavior had been exposed for what it really was, the way even his own son was looking at him now. It was all too much. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Look, he started, but he couldn't even finish the sentence. Instead, he just turned and walked toward the exit, his usual arrogance now replaced with quiet shame. The bell above the door jingled as it swung open. And just like that, he was gone. Morgan watched him leave but didn't say a word. Instead, he turned back toward Tommy and Sarah, his warm smile returning. "Well," he said, taking a step back, "I think my work here is done." Sarah laughed softly, wiping at her eyes. "More than done," she said. Tommy, still beaming, held up his race car. "Mom, do you think Mr. Freeman is a superhero?" Sarah smiled down at her son, then glanced at Morgan. "I think he's just a good man who knows how to make things right." Morgan chuckled. "That," he said, tipping an imaginary hat, "is the best compliment I've had in years." With that, he turned and headed for the exit, the bell jingling softly as he disappeared into the cold evening air. And in his wake, he left a lesson that no one in that store would ever forget. Tommy walked out of that store with his toy car, but he wasn't the only one who left changed. Greg had learned a lesson in humility. Sarah had found unexpected strength. And everyone who had witnessed the moment, they would never see kindness or cruelty the same way again. Greg stood outside Toy Kingdom, the cold air biting at his skin. He had walked out of the store without a word, his usual confidence shaken, replaced with something unfamiliar: shame. For the first time in a long while, he replayed his own words in his head, and for the first time, he truly heard them. Kids like him shouldn't be in public. Does he even understand what he's doing? The words had come out so easily, so thoughtlessly, yet now they weighed on him like a burden he couldn't shake. He had humiliated a child, not because the boy had done anything wrong, but because he had been different. Greg looked through the glass storefront, seeing Tommy clutching his red race car. His small face lit up with joy once more as he spoke excitedly to his mother. Morgan Freeman had stayed behind for a moment, crouching slightly to Tommy's level, listening as the boy enthusiastically described every detail of his new toy. Greg swallowed hard. He had wanted to make a boy feel small, and instead he had made himself feel smaller than ever before. Inside the store, Morgan Freeman finally stood, tipping his head toward Sarah before heading toward the exit. As he pushed open the door, Greg cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly. "Mr. Freeman," he started hesitantly. Morgan paused but didn't turn immediately. I I was wrong, Greg admitted, the words feeling foreign but necessary. Morgan turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. What was that? He asked, his voice calm, measured. Greg exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I was wrong, he repeated, about everything. Morgan studied him for a moment before nodding once. Admitting that is the first step, he said. Now let's see if you can take the second. Greg frowned. Which is, Morgan smiled faintly. Do better. With that, he stepped into the night, disappearing into the city's glow. Sarah and Tommy left the store soon after, Tommy clutching his new car like it was the most valuable thing in the world. Sarah glanced up at the sky, letting out a deep breath. Mom? Tommy asked, tilting his head curiously. Was Mr. Freeman a superhero? Sarah laughed softly, shaking her head. No, sweetheart, she said. He's just a good man who knows how to make things right. Tommy grinned. Then I want to be like him when I grow up. Sarah smiled, squeezing his hand. I think you already are. And they walked toward home. The lesson of the day remained imprinted in their hearts, in the hearts of every single person who had witnessed the moment. Because respect is not something to be earned based on ability, status, or wealth, it is something every human being deserves, simply for existing. And kindness? Kindness is the only thing that, when given away freely, always comes back even stronger.